In the late 80s, the term politically correct was taken from far-left academia and became common in use amongst conservatives who framed it as a way liberals were trying to shut down free speech. In a 1991 commencement ceremony for a graduating class at the University of Michigan, then-President George Bush Sr. used the term in his speech. The notion of political correctness has ignited controversy across the land, and although the movement arises from the laudable desire to sweep away the debris of racism and sexism and hatred, it replaces old prejudice with new ones. It declares certain topics off limits, certain expression off limits, and even certain gestures off limits. Hey guys, I haven't made a video in a while. As an elderly person, I spent my formative years in the 90s and my adolescence in the 2000s. And from my experience living through the 2000s, I felt that young people were not very politically active, at least compared to today. Besides a general air of George Bush did 9/11, most people I knew would consider themselves apolitical and just not interested in that sort of thing. It wasn't really cool to care, and being as aloof as possible and not being able to be offended by anything was kind of the golden standard for how to be a likable person. This sense of complacency kind of made it so that activists were considered radical. Activists in any form. They were kind of looked at as people who needed to chill out, because everything that was worth fighting for has already been fought for and won. Things like racism and sexism were solved back in the 90s, and we now live in a prejudice-free world where all races and genders enjoy equal opportunity, right? And I think from this mindset, being as offensive as possible and as shocking as possible became an accepted form of humor. Because people had this idea that bigotry was over. You could really say whatever you wanted and it would be considered ironic. Stereotyping people and making jokes about their ethnicity was considered harmless fun. Of course I don't actually believe that. And of course everybody didn't think this way. I'm pretty much talking about white people such as myself. Like, I definitely remember being in like 2003, 2004 and thinking that there wasn't really any sexism anymore. And I mean, it's literally what they taught me in schools, so I'm not surprised that that's what I believed. Now at this very same time, there happened to be a distinct lack of diversity in media. But if you were to call this out, you'd probably be looked at strangely, as if it was a dumb thing to be concerned about. And you might get a joke thrown at you about being too politically correct. In the mid-2000s, even most women would probably tell you that they're not a feminist. Everything is equal now. There's no sexism in 2003. To be a cool girl, you were expected to act like one of the guys. And at that time, most guys thought that feminism had gone too far and was now being tipped in the opposite direction, inciting hatred against men. And I'm definitely not saying that those people don't still exist today. It's just there has been a shift away from this being the dominant mentality. Throughout the 90s, right-wing politicians took the term politically correct from the left, which until then had been used sarcastically among academics since the 70s. And they spun it. They framed it as a movement that was trying to destroy free speech. In fact, 2 articles from late 1990 in both Newsweek and Forbes used the term thought police in their headlines. You can't say anything these days. Political correctness was used as an argument against liberal policies such as affirmative action, sanctions against hate speech, and revising school curriculums to be more historically accurate. The idea being that they could divert attention away from identity politics by framing them as something frivolous and not important. And conservatives did think that they were frivolous and unimportant, so that tracks. It also implies that something is merely politically correct, as opposed to actually correct. And from that, you can extrapolate that the political part is what makes it frivolous, which sort of insinuates that politics are frivolous. And this is the way I remember people using the term as a teenager in the 2000s. It had this implication attached to it, like politics don't matter, so you shouldn't care about them. Things are just going to happen the way they happen, whether you get involved or not. So, from my experience living through this time as a white nerdy boy, I have some thoughts about how this being offensive as humor thing happened. In the beginning of the 2000s, the internet had become a household necessity, much to the delight of the early adopters, white male nerds. White nerdy boys also tend to be a group that believe that they're oppressed. I feel like pop culture has sort of trained average nerdy boys to believe that they're better than other people.
Homer, that isn't very nice.
There's this narrative that in high school, the popular people are peaking now. and that nerdy boys are going to peak later, and that this is a valley for them. It typically plays out like all the things that are valued in high school are frivolous, based on looks, friends, things that white nerdy boys aren't very good at. Nerds believe that they're more evolved, more intelligent, and their talents just haven't been accessed yet. And with their largely unpleasant high school experiences of being outcasts, not getting any interest from girls, being generally unattractive, bad at sports, etc., frail, awkward. I mean, I can't relate to any of these things, but you can imagine. But it all tends to make them feel as if, they're the oppressed group and that the world is very unfair towards them. Now, I feel when the internet got normalized, that gave nerds a new sort of power. They had a head start. They were ahead of the trend. And the internet was the perfect place for them because it was anonymous. It didn't matter what they looked like. The internet was more about how funny you were or how smart you were or what you were creating. I don't know if anyone watching this is old enough to remember, but in 2002, the internet was basically entirely nerds. There was no social media, so all interaction pretty much occurred in video games, in chat rooms, forums, spaces where you're probably not going to find the quarterback or head cheerleader. At this time, the average high school student probably didn't consider this to be very cool. And I don't think the average person really figured out the power of the internet until a few years later. So for a while, the internet kind of existed as this parallel culture to mainstream culture. It had its own inside jokes. It had its own language. It had stuff that the average person would not be familiar with. These ancient kind of memes would never be on TV. You would never see them picked up in like a Taco Bell commercial like you might today. It's very different from today, where things like Instagram and Facebook and social media have kind of merged the real world with the internet. Mainstream culture is internet culture. They're the same now. It's nothing to see corporations use meme speak. It would have been really weird in 2003 to see a corporation use leaked speak on a commercial. My point is, I feel like the internet at the time kind of acted as an echo chamber for white nerds. And in this echo chamber, they kind of formed their own sense of humor, early internet humor. And due to the lack of diversity of its creators, this humor kind of excludes or is even at the expense of other groups of people. Just think about how words like the R slur were completely normalized even 10 years ago. Remember when like dead baby jokes was like the big thing? Holocaust jokes were hilarious. Kill all Jews was a quirky thing to say. This humor was seen as like pushing the envelope, or even being progressive in a way. There was an idea that using this type of humor normalized it and took away its power. But the people using it were not the same people who were historically oppressed by it. So of course they weren't offended. And can you take away the power of something that didn't have any power over you to begin with? In the mid-2000s, telling someone they couldn't say something because it was offensive was a huge no-no. That was reserved for only the absolute worst slurs. That's what happens when you interrupt the mic. And not even always then. I mean, can you imagine trying to tell someone that the term gypsy is offensive to the Romani people in 2005? You'd be looked at like a lunatic. Today, we would call someone with this offensive style of humor an edgelord. Urban Dictionary defines an edgelord as someone on an internet forum who deliberately talks about controversial, offensive, taboo, or nihilistic subjects in order to shock other users in an effort to appear cool or edgy. Now, as the internet grew, this type of humor grew with it, and eventually it hit the mainstream. And this was aided by a bunch of adult cartoons in the mid-2000s that used this style of edgelord humor.
Yeah, well, you're a stupid Jew. You're a Jew. Shut your goddamn Jew mouth!
Being as edgy as possible was the trajectory for humor at the time. Shows like South Park and Family Guy were absolutely idolized by teenage boys. For shows like Family Guy, being offensive was its entire premise.
You have AIDS. Yes, you have AIDS.
Because it's not the story. Now, my favorite example of this empowered nerd trope has to be the internet cult classic, Maddox. So if you're under 30, maddox.xmission.com, or the best page in the universe, was a website created by a man named George O. under the pseudonym of Maddox, where he posted opinion essays, loosely, on a variety of current topics. He framed himself as this hyper-masculine figure, and this was tongue-in-cheek. I think we all got that he was playing a character, but his content seemed to hold a lot of genuine beliefs. Going to Thailand, Don't forget your jackass discount card. If you've ever wanted to go to Asia, now's the time. Ticket prices are the lowest they've been in years because of the outbreak of irresponsible panic bullshit journalism, or IPBJ, throughout the media, a disease that causes the media to compensate for a lack of real news by hyping up the threat of some random virus such as SARS. Once you get SARS, you have a modest 91% chance of living. That is, if you can survive such grueling symptoms as headache, fever, and an overall feeling of discomfort and body aches. Look out, AIDS. That one just felt like relevant today for some reason. Maddox is the exact type of person who benefited from this culture. He felt powerful in the early 2000s. He was seen as someone smart who was speaking the truth that other people were afraid to say. And he didn't care about being politically correct. He used the anonymity of the internet to play up this masculine, manly man persona, and he exuded this air of confidence that many other young men looked up to, even releasing a book titled The Alphabet of Manliness in 2006, which remained on the New York Times bestseller list for 10 weeks. I grew up, as you might expect, in a majority white area. I wasn't very popular, I didn't have a lot of friends, I had no athletic ability. I was, however, constantly told by adults that I was smart. And I think that's just because I spent a lot of time on the computer and was quiet. And my glasses? I mean, it wasn't my grades. And looking back, I think this treatment gave me a lot of entitlement. This feeling that I wasn't getting what I deserved. And that the other students were overlooking me. And I became resentful of this, which made me a good target to be assimilated into this culture. So I discovered Maddox as a 12-year-old. And it was a bad influence on me. I saw him as this intelligent person who didn't put up with bullshit. And at that age, I was just starting to become familiar with how much bullshit there is in the world. I probably spent a year or so thinking he was the coolest thing around. And I would adopt his opinions on topics that I didn't know anything about just to feel more like him. Fortunately, this was pretty short-lived, and by the time I was 14, I had the self-awareness to look at him as more of like a internet man-baby. But even at that time, he had a lot of followers. He had millions of viewers. He was revered by neckbeards all across the globe. But as the internet grew and became more mainstream, and as mindsets began to shift, Maddox started to lose his grip on his audience and was losing his influence. His writings got less and less views, and eventually he gave into the modern day and started a YouTube channel. Imagine starting a YouTube channel. Now, Maddox on YouTube was immediately recognized as a skinny, aging, balding nerd.
Welcome to the best show in the universe, I'm Maddox. Facebook quizzes are stupid.
The mystique he used to have of being this influential, powerful person was completely stripped away. And all that was left was, well... So it's towards the end of the decade that we start to see culture shift. Heavy hitters like MySpace and Facebook had brought the majority of people to the internet, and their voices started to become part of the conversation. And I think the truth started to come out, and it's that a lot of people were uncomfortable with this style of edgelord humor. They had just previously lacked the power or even education to bring it up in conversation. And when they finally felt like they had some power, that's when the white men started to feel pushback. And I think this started a cultural rift where people felt like they had to pick a side. You were either a crazy social justice warrior, or you were completely against it, and you thought political correctness was destroying comedy. So the edgelords started to revolt. They started crying that everybody all of a sudden was oversensitive. We start getting terms like special snowflake and liberal tears. If it wasn't a problem for us to say this stuff before, why now? This younger generation is too damn sensitive. But I don't think people got more sensitive. I think that the oppressed just didn't feel comfortable enough to challenge the dominant belief system. But now that there's more diversity in their spaces and minorities feel like they're being heard, people are being confronted and challenged for things they wouldn't have been before. So in 2010, a webcomic by the name of Penny Arcade made a comic making light of World of Warcraft quests. In it, a character is described as being raped to sleep by the dick wolves. The joke wasn't necessarily about rape itself, but more about how the quests in the game often have questionable ethics. But Penny Arcade fans, several of whom are women now, took issue with the topic of rape being used so frivolously, and several survivors of rape expressed their discomfort with it. Now, instead of taking the comic down and providing an apology, which would probably be the move in 2020, Penny Arcade decided to mock the people who took issue with the joke. They took the triggered angle and claimed it was ridiculous for anyone to be offended by it. And then they made a follow-up comic doubling down. And in this comic, you can see that they didn't even really understand the concern. They thought people were insinuating that their comic was causing people to become rapists, when it was really more about a general level of respect for survivors of rape. So as you probably guessed, the drama didn't end there. A few months later, Penny Arcade started to poke at the wound even more and released a line of merch based around the idea of dick wolves. So there was some fiery discourse in the fan base about whether or not this joke is offensive, how people should be reacting to it, what Penny Arcade should be doing. And among all that, a certain group of Penny Arcade fans ended up creating a group called Team Rape, with the intention of harassing anti-rape activists. It's not the look. And this resulted in many of the women who complained about the comics getting threats of violence and death made against them, because of course it did. So I view this as an early example of the internet culture shifting and white men failing to adapt because of their privilege, as in the unlikelihood that they would ever experience a rape or ever have to worry about that, as opposed to every woman on Earth. The creators of Penny Arcade were unable to empathize with the plights of the women, and they felt that their art was being censored, that there was a freedom of speech issue. The women were being too politically correct. I think if this joke was made even a few years earlier, they would have gotten away with it. And if you go back as far as even 2003, 2004, their audience would have been almost entirely white men. And what small percentage of women or minorities were in there wouldn't feel comfortable saying anything. They would know that speaking up would make them seem crazy or unlikable. I think that there's this belief within the right that all of these new social justice activists, people fighting for representation, the massive surge of gay, bi, and trans people, that they just can't be genuine. They always say, well, there wasn't that many gay people 20 years ago. There wasn't that many gay people when I was growing up. Why are there so many now? They must be faking it for attention or for a sense of superiority, and that they want to use it to actually get more power than other people. Feminists don't want to be seen as equal. They want to be seen as better. Black people want to be treated better than other people. And to be fair, some black people should be treated better than other people. But to white men whose lives have always been centered around whiteness and maleness, equality feels like oppression, especially when it comes at the expense of behaviors that they've normalized and have become comfortable with, like the use of offensive jokes, which they've built their entire personality off of. How could my entire internet personality have become unacceptable in the past 5 years? They must be overreacting and looking for something to get mad at. This is an attack against the white male. And to be completely fair, around this time, the left was going a bit, well, hard, particularly on Tumblr. Tumblr became the home of this movement. And among genuinely thoughtful and reasoned cultural critiques, there was an underbelly of very young people identifying as elves and dragons and sort of exploring their gender identities through unconventional means. And a lot of the discourse on Tumblr was written by people who had been marginalized for so long and were so fed up that they came across as really defensive and angry, which, although is understandable, is off-putting to someone you're trying to, spread new ideas to. I have a suspicion that I can't prove that this cultural divide politicized the white nerdy boys who used to be apolitical or libertarian and led them towards the right, and sometimes the alt-right. I think the normalization of the kill all Jews brand of comedy acted as a sort of precursor to people feeling comfortable sharing their actual bigoted views. Once they felt like something was being taken from them, they were motivated to maintain the status quo and preserve the power they had, which is very conservative. I think this phenomenon can be seen in 4chan, which in the mid-2000s was just shitposting. People in 4chan in the 2000s didn't really seem to have any strong political affiliations. It was mostly just a place where memes came from. But nowadays, it's a breeding ground for the alt-right. Most of the discussions on there are just back and forths about how they can mobilize to best trigger the libs. And as a white man who grew up in that period, and did enjoy, and still enjoys, some aspects of edgy humor, I can on some level understand how that happened. It took me a few years to come around to the nuance of what was being presented to me by social justice activists. And frankly, I was a little bit tainted by attending art school in the early 2010s, where I came in contact with a lot of really off-putting radical leftists. But through educating myself and thinking rationally, and you know how us white men love to think rationally, I've been able to relate more to struggles I don't experience, and struggles I wasn't even aware of, which I think has made me a more rational, balanced, and empathetic person. Because yes, I've come to learn that emotional intelligence is in fact a valid form of intelligence. And being rational does not mean disregarding everyone's feelings and viewing everything purely objectively. I mean, do men know that anger is an emotion? I think we can all relate to that feeling of saying something minor on the internet and then being slammed by a social justice warrior. Maybe you're being called out for poor phrasing, or for saying something you didn't even know was problematic and had no way in hell of assuming. But even when the person calling you out is being aggressive and accusatory and just makes the situation feel very hostile, you should do your best to try to be emotionally conscious of the situation. Try to have that emotional and rational intelligence to be able to take in what they're telling you and think critically about it instead of immediately pivoting to anger. It's really easy to feel angry when you're challenged on something you weren't expecting. We all have that "these triggered SJWs" thought go through our minds sometimes. I know I do whenever a coffee shop only offers non-fat organic soy milk. And by no means am I saying that anyone who calls themselves an activist is always right about everything. I fully believe there are some people out there giving bad faith criticisms just for the sense of superiority. You could definitely be wrongly called out by a ridiculous person. But I just want to encourage you to be conscious of your own biases and try to accept criticism objectively and not as an indictment of your character. And it can take a lot of self-awareness and maturity to be able to do this. But the truth is, a lot of people did not feel comfortable and didn't feel included by the golden age of the internet in 2005. And a lot of people are still not comfortable now, because there's a lot more to do. For example, right now the world is having a really hard time letting go of the ability to make fun of fat people. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of how deeply rooted ableism is in society. And if you hadn't noticed, there's a bit of a race thing going on. Your immediate reaction to criticism might be to think about yourself and how you might lose out and not being able to make jokes at the expense of these people anymore. But think of it this way. Do you want to contribute to people feeling bad about things that they cannot change? Is there anything about you yourself that society makes you feel bad about? Do you want to contribute to that feeling in others? So to me, it's not so much a question of being politically correct versus freedom of speech, as much as it's, do you want to hold on to behaviors that are harmful to other people? If you like this video, please bully me in the comments below.
Welcome to the best show in the universe. I'm Maddox.